Previously, we noted how chapters 13 and 21 are chiastically linked, bound together by failures of David to follow Mosaic law, and they result in tragedy. This chapter, 21, is pretty dense, but we're mostly going to focus on two issues. One, who incited David to take the census? Or how do we reconcile the first verse of 2 Samuel 24 and the first verse of 1 Chronicles 21? Was it God or was it Satan who incited David to take the census? The second issue we're going to deal with is, what do we make of David's census, period? What was wrong with it? And so we're going to take those two issues one at a time. And if we're going to assume it's not just a blatant contradiction between the two passages, the way most people deal with this issue is to understand it kind of the way Job works, where you have Satan is on a bit of a leash, if you will, and God's ultimately in control. And so it's seen through that lens of this secondary, tertiary cause kind of way in which Satan could be seen as being the one who incites David. So it's that kind of lens through which people generally discuss this so-called contradiction or tension. And I think that the answer can function. I think it works if you need it to, but I don't think that that's what's going on here. So we're going to take a very different trajectory here. And to understand that, we first need to discuss the term Satan and take into account we're dealing here with translation. So the Hebrew term Satan or Satan generally means something like adversary or accuser, something to that effect. It's someone who stands in opposition to someone else. And sometimes in our English translations, the word is translated, often to the term adversary or something like that. Other times, the word is transliterated to Satan, capital S, Satan, as is the case in Job and other places. So then the question is, how do we translate the term in 1 Chronicles? Or do we transliterate it? Now, what we're going to find here is Chronicles, the reference here is kind of unique. It's unusual in a way. So to begin, I'm going to quote here from, this is the Expositor's Bible Commentary, and it's going to give us a good lay of the land. And they write, despite the translation in verse 1, the chronicler does not necessarily have the personal being, capital S, Satan, in view. The term is rare in the Old Testament and is only found here in Chronicles. The term Satan is a transliteration of the Hebrew term, Satan, meaning adversary or accuser, with capitalization or its lack reflecting whether a general adversary or the adversary accuser, i.e. the devil, is in view. Use of this term wherein the supernatural adversary or devil is clearly in view is reflected in the first two chapters of Job and Zechariah. Note that in these occurrences in Job and Zechariah, the term Satan has the Hebrew definite article, underscoring the notion of the adversary. This will actually become important, the definite article, which is the word the, or the, T-H-E. And believe it or not, it's pretty important. But they're pointing out here in Job and Zechariah, it's always ha-Satan, it's the Satan, or the adversary. However, the term in 1 Chronicles 21:1 does not have the Hebrew article. This has prompted some scholars to take the term as a proper name, but this is a significant distinction from the instances in Job and Zechariah that should not be minimized and may reflect the chronicler's intent of signaling a human adversary. Now, I'm going to differ here that there is another option. It's not just simply capital S Satan or a human adversary. There's another option, but this is well put. Now, I do kind of have to pause here, though, and point out one aspect of this. And this gets a little bit into Hebrew, but English works the same way, so this isn't that difficult to follow. In Hebrew, they don't append the definite article to a proper name or proper noun. In other words, they don't put the word the in front of a name. So you don't get the David, for instance. Now, you could say the king, but that's because it's a title. So usually, in the Old Testament, we have ha-Satan, the Satan. But in 1 Chronicles 21, there is no definite article, and it's just Satan. So some commentators say, okay, there we can have capital S, Satan, functioning as a name. Now, this is significant because what some commentators will do with this is they will then say, this is a reflection of late Hebrew religion, and it's influenced by Zoroastrianism or whatever. So you kind of have this like dualistic thing going on. And usually part of the reason they go in that direction is they assume that because 2 Samuel 24 has God inciting David to take the census, here the chronicler is inserting a new character to kind of take the blame, if you will. And so they take this interpretation, I think, for theological considerations or whatever. As we're going to see, that's not really valid. But that's part of why the definite article becomes so important, because of the fact that if it drops out, it could be a proper name. But again, it's not quite that easy, as we'll see here below in Japheth's comments here. And she's largely interacting with this idea that this is kind of like, it's a proper name, and now this is a new stage in Israelite religion or something. She says, this generally accepted view needs reconsideration. It should be remarked at the outset that from a linguistic point of view, the course by which a common noun becomes a proper noun in Hebrew is different from the one presupposed above. And she's specifically talking about this idea that you drop the definite article, it now becomes a name. That's what she's largely been interacting with. She says, in general, the transition is affected in Hebrew by the addition of the article. Examples can be abundantly cited. The same route is followed in post-biblical Hebrew. Kadosh is a general adjective, holy, and so it became ha-kadosh, the holy, right, referring to God. So they added the definite article into the term holy, and it became the holy. They similarly did this with gracious. It became the gracious, and that was a reference to God. It was like a circumlocution. And she says, only when the noun had completely and absolutely lost its original meaning could it be found as a proper noun without the article. This, however, is not the case under consideration. The meaning of Satan as a common noun still continues to exist, denoting adversary. It is, therefore, with the article that evil as a specific divine being had to be represented, as is indeed demonstrated by the occurrences of the noun in Zechariah and Job. In post-biblical literature, where Satan does function as the embodiment of evil, the name is still used with the article. From a purely linguistic point of view, it is in fact the absence of the article which should raise doubts about understanding it as a proper noun. So her point being that because it lacks the definite article, that actually undermines the idea that this is a proper name, rather than making it a proper name, which is the assumption that many people will draw. So here I've exported all the references in the Old Testament to the term Satan. And so here we have the references in this column. We have how the ESV translates it, what kind of being we're dealing with, and does it have the definite article. Now, as we can see, if we focus here on all the occurrences in Job and Zechariah, we have like complete symmetry here. They all get translated the same way. They're all referencing a divine being. They all have the definite article. So those all make sense. Where things start getting interesting is the rest of them, the others. Now, if we were to just look at the references in Samuel and Kings, and also we can throw in this one in Psalm 109:6, again, we have pretty much symmetry. Well, they all are referencing humans. None of them have the definite article. And all of these are translated adversary, except in Psalm 109 where it's accuser. And it makes sense in that context because it's more of like a legal courtroom kind of scene. And so it makes sense to translate Satan as accuser or something like that. But it's for this reason that people look at this and say, well, if the definite article isn't being used, then perhaps it's a reference to a human. Because, the argument would go, perhaps David was tempted, if you will, by a human adversary. And because what we're going to find is that the census is a military census. And so perhaps he was worried about some foreign power or whatever. And so he decides to count his troops. And so that makes sense because it lacks a definite article here. And so that would fall in line with the other usages. And again, that would work. I'm not sure how that would answer the tension or the supposed contradiction between 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21, but some go in this direction, and you can see why. But what you never read in any of these commentaries is that this isn't the only usage of Satan without the definite article. You have it twice. You have it in Numbers, where it's the angel of the Lord. The Hebrew term Satan is used of him because it's standing in opposition to Balaam in that particular story. So if we were to throw in the Chronicles reference here, then it would also make sense if we said that this is a reference actually to the angel of the Lord. It's a very subtle reference back to the Numbers 22 passage, where the angel of the Lord is standing against Balaam. Here, the angel of the Lord is standing against David. And so I think this is a legitimate option. And so let's go ahead and start marshaling evidence for this view. This here is from Heiser's book, the I Dare You Not to Bore Me with the Bible book. And he has a chapter on this. He also had a Faith Life, or the Bible Study Magazine article on this. So you can maybe find it online somewhere. But here he's addressing this issue. And is again pointing out the incongruity of the two passages. And so let's just go ahead and pick up somewhere in here. And a lot of this is going to be ground that we already tread. So there are only a handful of places in the Hebrew Bible where Satan is not preceded by the definite article. 1 Chronicles 21:1 is one of them, and thus many interpreters see this as a rare instance of the being known as Satan appearing in the Old Testament. If this is the case, though, we have a blatant contradiction. There is a better explanation. The only other place in the Old Testament where Satan lacks the definite article, and the term is used of a divine figure, is Numbers 22:22, where we read that the angel of Yahweh stood in the way of Balaam and his donkey as an adversary. Again, literally Satan. The angel was opposing Balaam. He was a divinely appointed adversary, like the Satan in 1 Chronicles 21. This connection between the word Satan and the angel of Yahweh is crucial to understanding the discrepancy between Chronicles and Samuel. In both accounts, the angel dispenses God's judgment upon David. God and the angel of the Lord were frequently identified with each other in the Old Testament. For example, Exodus 3, that's the burning bush. Joshua 5:13 through 15. This is the commissioning of Joshua, and this is going to become a very important passage. And Judges 6, this is the call of Gideon. Thus, it seems that we don't have Satan, God's cosmic enemy, in the Chronicles passage. Instead, the writer is referring to the angel, who is Yahweh in human form. I would say invisible form. Something to that effect. Not necessarily human, per se. But this means that both the writers of Chronicles and 2 Samuel have Yahweh initiating the census, and there is no contradiction. He closes out the article by discussing why God would do this, and he kind of compares it to Nebuchadnezzar, and as well as you could also throw in Pharaoh, the hardening of the heart, and that kind of idea. But that's a different aspect of the story that I don't necessarily want to go down right now, because that would detain us for too long. Now, as we continue on, we're going to find many more connections between, especially Chronicles and Numbers. But like I noted, the Joshua 5 passage is really interesting because it's one of actually 3 passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. It's specifically in verse 13 of Joshua, where you have the phrase, something to the effect of, with a drawn sword in his hand, or in his hand a drawn sword. And it's referring to the angel of the Lord in each of these 3 occurrences in the Old Testament. But the 3 occurrences are 1 Chronicles 21:16. So in the chapter we're dealing with here with the census, and Joshua 5:13 specifically, and in Numbers 22, again, the Balaam story, where you have the Satan without the definite article. So this creates a tight link between these 3 passages. They're the only passages with this sword language. 2 of these passages are the only ones with a divine being called Satan without the definite article, which links the angel of the Lord to all 3 passages. Again, this would mean that there's no contradiction with these 3 passages. And even though it doesn't call the captain of the Lord's host in Joshua the angel of the Lord, it's a pretty easy conclusion to draw, especially since the angel tells Joshua while he commissions him. He uses the same language back at the burning bush in Exodus 3. Take the sandals off your feet, you're standing on holy ground. The language is very similar. So the fact that we're dealing here with the same being, and that being is actually, God in visible form, it just really tightens the connections in all of these passages. Now, we'll actually continue on with the second issue, but even in that, we're going to find more and more information that I think strengthens this argument. But before we do move forward, I will point out, though, it is important that I make this clear. The biggest argument against this would be just how rare and obscure the argument is. You're not going to really find anybody saying this, going in this direction. Very few scholars do it. Heiser is one, Paul Evans is another, and that's basically all that I know of. Ancient, modern commentators, even translators, ancient, modern, didn't go in this direction. But I feel like the evidence compels you to go in this direction. And if that is the case, it makes all these points moot about this supposedly being, the chronicler doing some kind of apologetics work of trying to get God off the hook for inciting David to take the census. That's not what's going on at all. In fact, again, we'll start hitting on that issue here. So now to the second issue. concerning the census. What's wrong with the census? What was it? Well, again, first we probably need to keep in our mind that this is a military census. This is specifically David trying to find out what his military strength is. But the problem itself seems to be one of two things, or I would say it's both and. On the one hand, to take the census, to count, to number the people, is in some way to doubt the promises of God, that he would make the people too many to count. They would be like the stars, things like that. So he's not really trusting on the promise. And again, we'll elaborate on this. The other problem with this is that there actually was a proper way to conduct a census, a military census, and that's laid out in Exodus 30. But David doesn't do it by that law. So this, again, remember, we're chiastically linked with chapter 13, where David failed to move the ark in a way that was consistent with Mosaic law. Well, here, he's inconsistent with Mosaic law concerning how to do this census. So like chapter 13, again, they are punished for how they're treating their relationship with God, essentially. But we'll begin here discussing why the test at all, why conduct this test on Israel and David by extension. Hahn writes in his commentary on page 87, the chronicler recasts the entire event as a covenant testing, similar to the earlier testings of Abraham and the children of Israel in the wilderness. This explains the underlying imagery of the Akedah and the Exodus found in the accounts. So we're going to find imagery of both of those events. The Akedah is the binding of Isaac. And this is apparently how David interprets the event. In his great final prayer in Chronicles, he seems to refer to the census. I know, my God, that thou triest the heart. The word that David uses here is a synonym of the biblical term used elsewhere to describe God's testing of his covenant family. God tested Abraham in asking for the sacrifice of his only son, and again sought to prove, again the same language, his firstborn Israel in the wilderness. In the final pages of this work, the chronicler will use the same terminology again to describe the testing of the new David, Hezekiah, and that's in 2 Chronicles 32-31, near the very end of the book. And here John Stone is hitting on some similar themes. He says, for David to count the people is thus to fly in the face of God's promise. It is to check up on the fulfillment of the promise and amounts to doubting it. Note David's stated purpose in holding the census, that he may know their number. In verse 2, it is not enough for him to trust the promise of God about the uncountability of Israel as the people of God. As in the story of the tree of knowledge in Genesis 2 and 3, he seeks humanly to know in order to supplement, if not supplant, unquestioning reliance upon God. And he contrasts this with 1 Chronicles 14:2, where David says something to the effect of it says, now David knew that the Lord had established him, and that kind of idea. But here David is trying to know, as Adam and Eve desired to know. And moving on, here Hahn is again hitting on the same thing. Why would God test the people? Well, a big part of the answer for Hahn is that it goes down to this idea of primogeniture, which, the firstborn and the father and the firstborn son, that kind of idea. So he's pointing out that the covenant has this paternal filial shape. Adam and Israel are portrayed as firstborn sons, and of course, the king becomes the begotten son of God. You are my son, today I have begotten you, in that kind of language. He says that this suggests a previously unimaginable intimacy between God and his chosen king. The king must truly be a man after the heart of God. And for that, he requires a divine pedagogy that includes testing the strength of his faith through the temptation. And I would put here actually testing or something to that effect, because I think for us, temptation has this negative connotation that almost implies you want the person to do the thing, where I think testing lacks that kind of language. A teacher gives a pop quiz, but they don't intend for the students to fail. But it's a test. We need to know where you're at in this thing. And so similarly, I think that's what's going on. That this is the point that they're making through and again, I would say testing of the census. The Son of God, Israel, and Israel's king are being trained and disciplined in God's fatherly ways. Moses had described Israel's testing in the wilderness in such terms. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. Deuteronomy 8:5. In the typological writing of his account, the chronicler clearly has the wilderness years in view, in addition to the testing of Abraham. David's sin, like Israel's in the wilderness, threatens God's firstborn with extinction. And so in the case of Abraham, Isaac, in the case of David, the entire nation of Israel, there is a deadly irony here in that God sends the angel of the Lord destroying, in verse 12, the same expression used to describe the angel of death sent to destroy the Egyptians' firstborn in the Exodus. The angel that once destroyed Israel's enemy is now sent to destroy Israel. The irony continues as the sword of the angel is mentioned repeatedly, as if to say that no matter how many swordsmen David can muster, Israel will never be any match for the sword of Yahweh. The chronicler draws his dramatic picture with allusions to 2 episodes from the late wilderness era. And note which 2 episodes he's going to pick. The first allusion is to the blessing of Israel by Balaam, who had been hired by the Moabite king to curse Israel. The chronicler's earlier reference to David's sacrificial offering of 7 bulls and 7 rams may have been an allusion to the only other place where that exact offering was made by Balaam before his prophecy of the shout of a king in Israel. And we talked about this in chapter 15. So this is the movement of the ark. And remember, they're shouting and it's festive and whatnot. And they offer the 7 bulls and 7 rams. Again, the only other place is when Balaam prophesies about the shout of a king. Again, so it really kind of draws these 2 together. But he questioned, maybe not that this is a reference back. But he says here, in chapter 21, an allusion is unquestionable. In Numbers 22:22 and verse 31, God places an angel as adversary, literally Satan, to stand against Balaam. Again, the same terminology used, and block his way, just as he sends Satan against David and Israel. I find it so interesting because it's like, here he's making that connection, but it's like he doesn't go all the way to say, well, maybe the Satan in 1 Chronicles 1 is actually the same. It's the angel of the Lord in both passages. But continuing on, he says, Balaam's eyes are open to see an angel with a drawn sword in his hand, as David's are open to see the destroying angel also with a drawn sword in his hand. Balaam falls on his face at the sight, as David and the elders do. And Balaam confesses, I have sinned. David too uses these exact words in verse 7 and verse 17. The chronicler also seems to be drawing from an episode in Joshua 5:13 through 15. Again, the other episode we talked about. Joshua, like David, lifts up his eyes to see a man standing against him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua too falls on his face, where the man identifies himself as the commander of the Lord's army and tells him that he is standing on holy ground. There appears to be more than literary artistry at work in the chronicler's use of these allusions. The episodes in both Joshua and Numbers take place when Israel is encamped across the Jordan from Jericho on the threshold of the Promised Land. I find this really interesting. He doesn't actually point this out, but in the last video we did chapters 19 and 20. In chapter 19, I'm pretty sure it's chapter 19, specifically I think it's verse 17, we actually get the detail that they crossed over the Jordan to engage in one of these battles. But that's just really interesting because, again, that would also then tie these 3 passages together. The crossing of the Jordan. They're about to cross it in Numbers and Joshua. In the case of 1 Chronicles, they already have crossed it. But continuing on with Han, he says, as the fragmentary story in Joshua ends with his recognizing that he is in a holy place, Balaam's encounter with the angel in Numbers 22 leads to his erecting altars and offering sacrifices in Numbers 23. And in addition to prophesying a king for Israel, Balaam refers to the very covenant promise that David is guilty of forgetting in 1 Chronicles 21. Who can count the dust of Jacob or number the 4th part of Israel? That's Numbers 23:10. What these earlier stories anticipated is being fulfilled here in Chronicles. Joshua's conquest of the land has been completed by David, and David's encounter with the sword-bearing angel will now lead to the revealing of the definitive holy place and altar. Just so many connections between these 2 passages that I don't think it's coincidental that, again, you have Satan without the definite article used of a divine being to pinpoint the angel of the Lord in 1 Chronicles 21 verse 1 and over in Numbers 22. But continuing further, we're going to get a little bit into the second aspect of the failure here, where John Stone is going to argue here that it's this failure of this Exodus 30 legislation, specifically verses 11 through 16. We'll pick up here. In page 227 of Johnstone's commentary, he says, the census is designed as a muster to establish the military capability of Israel. This is tantamount to checking up on the ability of Israel to be the Lord's host, to carry out the Lord's purpose, and on the ability of the Lord to work through and to defend his own people. It is this military purpose of David that leads into the heart of his offense. A census is, in fact, legitimate, but it must be carried out in the approved manner. And that is certainly not by the commander-in-chief of the citizen army acting with the other army commanders at the king's behest. But we'll continue on. Lightheart is making similar observations. He says, going to war without paying the atonement, the tax in this case, is like attempting to enter the sanctuary without the protective veils that screen human beings from the holy God. David also bypasses the Levites, who are normally essential to the conduct of war. And here, Johnstone is going to get to the heart of the matter in this comment here. So on page 228 and 29, he says, Chronicles both illuminates and applies this legislation, again, the Exodus 30 legislation. The Israelite males from 20 and upward are registered for military service. War is not being glorified. Military service is only legitimate within the context of fighting the Lord's battles as the Lord's host. Killing on the field of battle is an inevitable consequence of war. But taking life of another human being immediately warrants the payment of life for life. And this reference here, especially in Numbers, is very interesting because it's hitting on the idea that there is no atonement for shedding blood other than your blood, right? Blood for blood, that kind of idea. And so it's a very serious thing, even in legitimate contexts like war. So that's why this legislation is so serious. He continues, the sequence of 1 Chronicles 21, after the account of David's bloody wars in chapters 18 through 20, now takes on an ominous note. Only the necessary sacral preparation for war, as the Lord's war, can avert that inevitable forfeiture of life by those who take life. It is that sacral preparation that the legislation in Exodus 30, 11 through 16 provides. The half shekel given by all is the indemnity laid upon as a perpetual reminder before the Lord for the life of you all. That is, not just of the combatants, but of the community at large, on whose behalf the host sallies forth, and which might suffer because of the bloodshed by the host. This reminds me a bit of some of the laws, like in Leviticus, for instance. You have ideas how they, like if a woman gives birth, for instance, or menstruation, or if a man has a nocturnal emission, or if you touch a corpse. These are all parts of life and death. But those things would make you ritually impure. So they had these rites that they had to follow to keep themselves at oneness with God. Blood is necessarily going to be shed at war, but you have to do this proactively, and that's what he's going to get to here. He says, this legislation is concerned precisely with atonement, the maintenance of the oneness between community and God, which will otherwise be broken even by acts of necessary bloodshed. These rites of atonement are not, thus, in response to actions already committed. They are not retrospective to restore what has already been disturbed. They are, rather, precautionary, prospective measures, which anticipate the possibility of bloodshed. They are rites of prophylactic atonement that have to be observed as the people set out to war in order to maintain the existing oneness of Israel with God. It is David's neglect of these necessary preliminaries to the muster of the host of Israel, with the involvement of the Levites, that lies at the heart of his offense, which will bring the penalty not just on himself, but on Israel. The sequel is about to show the catastrophic consequences of the neglect of this legislation, the plague that befalls the people. And he points out here that the punishment that's spelled out in Exodus 30, verse 12, specifically, if they don't follow this commandment, it's the same terminology used of the plague that follows in Chronicles. And so I think that this makes it very much part of the equation, this legislation, because some of the commentators will kind of dismiss the Exodus 30 legislation because there are comments that are made that very much seem to highlight the fact that it was about counting the people, and that was wrong because of the fact that God would make them too many to count, and that kind of idea. And I think that there's legitimacy to that. But there's also language that I think explicitly connects to this idea of atonement. We'll hit that when we proceed. But continuing on, because these rites of prospective prophylactic atonement have been ignored, rites of retroactive atonement, the repairing of the relationship damaged through that failure, have now to be brought into operation. As 1 Chronicles 22:1 makes clear, and this is the guilt language, incurring guilt now becomes one of the key terms of Chronicles theology. It links David's failure with the basic legislation on holiness, the guilt incurred through Ma'al, the infringement of holiness, and the possibility of atonement in Leviticus 5:14 through 6:7, which Chronicles is now expounding at length in narrative form in his book. So shall one be forgiven for committing any of the acts by which one may incur guilt. And moving on, Lightheart is going to point out here again that some of these connections with Exodus, with the Passover and that kind of idea here, where you have the slaughter of the firstborn in Egypt in retribution for Pharaoh's enslavement of Yahweh's son Israel. Now the death angel is back, and that's what this is referring to, slaughtering Israelites instead. The typology assigns David the role of Pharaoh, seizing God's people for his own purpose. He has turned Israel into an Egypt, and a Passover sacrifice is needed to stay the plague. And again, remember the plagues of Egypt, for instance. David is also an Adam, seizing forbidden fruit, God's host. The census is a sacrilege, an intrusion on Yahweh's realm and his host. Contrary to what some commentators say, the chronicler does not whitewash David's reign. And this is extremely common in the commentaries to read this kind of thing. And he's about to, Lightheart that is about to offer a very sobering critique of that view. He says, the census is as great a sin as adultery and murder, because it is a direct and flagrant trespass into Yahweh's rights. It is a variation of David's sin with Bathsheba, but on a national scale. In 2 Samuel, David seizes the wife of a single warrior. In 1 Chronicles, David seizes the host of Yahweh and treats it as if it were his own. With Bathsheba, David committed something resembling statutory, if not actual rape. The census is worse. He rapes the pride of Yahweh, and that's just, it shows you how deep this error by David actually was. And kind of in a similar vein, Selman has a couple of observations here that are interesting, because he's pointing out here that there are touch points with the whole Bathsheba incident in the way that this story is described. So he says the significance of David's sin has actually been increased rather than reduced, as many writers have alleged. Important material is added in verses 6 and 7 and in certain phrases in verses 3 and 17. Other changes have increased the striking resemblance between this incident and that of David's murder and adultery in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, as the following correspondences show. So here's the links. He says, A, only in these two incidents does David make the simple confession, I have sinned, which is the turning point in both narratives. B, David's sin results in death for Israel. C, prophetic disapproval is voiced, and Chronicles repeats the prophetic messenger formula, thus says the Lord, to emphasize the point. D, God's punishment is effected through the sword. E, David is forgiven by God's word of promise. And F, God grants forgiveness through his covenant promises. Both the house of God and David's house dynasty had been threatened directly by David's sins, but God pointedly restores both houses, in 2 Samuel through David's heir Solomon, and in 1 Chronicles through the building of the temple. And he actually goes on and then contrasts how they're different, but for the sake of time, we won't head into that. And here, Lightheart in page 74 of his commentary is pointing out the threshing floor language. He says, it is significant that David offers the atoning sacrifice on the threshing floor. Uzzah died at the threshing floor when he touched the ark in chapter 13, and Solomon will later build the temple on this very site, which is on Mount Moriah. A threshing floor is where wheat and chaff are separated and sifted, and thus becomes a symbol of judgment. And I would argue also testing. I have a whole video that I did on threshing symbology, and I would encourage you to check that out because it really fits with this theme nicely. Threshing is an early moment in the process of bread making, and now the threshing floor of Ornan becomes a part of the festive site, the house of bread, the temple. Continuing on, John Stone says, Chronicles addition, the site of the threshing floor, has within it the overtone already of sanctuary. And here he says compared to Joshua 5:15. Hardly surprisingly, Chronicles has added the link between the purchase price and the averting of the plague. This is really interesting. I'm not sure if we're thinking of the same thing, but we might be. And so I want to kind of loop back to this point, but we'll pick up Myers here because this is going to hit on the same point. So Myers notes here that there's a difference in the price. between Samuel and Chronicles. One is in Samuel, it's 50 shekels of silver for the oxen and threshing floor, so on and so forth. In Chronicles, it's 600 shekels of gold for the threshing floor alone. And he's saying it may be due to the fact that David could not have paid less for the property of Ornan than Abraham had paid for the cave of Machpelah, because he is regarded as the greatest Hebrew of them all, so on and so forth. Curtis suggests that since gold figures so prominently in the temple, the chronicler characteristically puts the price in terms of gold with his typical exaggerations, 12 times the amount given in 2 Samuel. As Rashi speculates, he may have thought of 50 shekels as the contribution for each tribe, since the temple was for all Israel. So in other words, the 50 shekels comes from Samuel, and Chronicles multiplies it by 12, because again, as he said, the temple was going to be for all of Israel. Now, I think this is an interesting note, but I'll come back to it. Attention may also be called to the tradition connecting the Mount Moriah of Abraham and the Mount Zion of David, which may be in the background of the writer's mind. Now, typically, I don't find a lot of value in the later rabbinic material, but this is interesting, especially if taken with what Johnstone says here, that Chronicles has added the link between the purchase price and the averting of the plague. Like I said, I'm not sure if we're thinking about the same thing, but in First Chronicles, I want to say it's verse 20. Well, we were in verse 25. Oops, 2:5. So this is where he pays the price. And of course, verse 24 is the well-known fact that David said to Ornan, "No, I will buy them for the full price. I will not take for the Lord what's yours, nor offer burnt offerings that cost me nothing." So that's part of it, but specifically I think it's verse 22, where he says, and David said to Ornan, "Give me the site of the threshing floor, that I may build on it an altar to the Lord. Give it to me at its full price, that the plague may be averted from the people." And so what I'm thinking that Johnstone means by this, like I said, I'm not really sure. It really makes sense if you kind of do this in Yoda speak and reverse it. Say that the plague may be averted from the people. Give it, that is the threshing floor side, all this stuff, give it to me at the full price. So there he's connecting the full price, again, the 50 times 12, to the plague being averted. And I think that makes sense, especially if this is retroactive, because he didn't do the proactive thing of offering the tax. Now he retroactively has to involve a cost that includes all 12 tribes. So in that sense, I think what Rashi was getting at might kind of work, although I don't think it is true that it's about all of the tribes in the temple and whatever, it's for all of them. But I think that the cost is associated with all 12 tribes because he needed to include them so as to avert the plague. So this actually gives you logic into what David is thinking. Something has to cost him. He needs to be hurt monetarily in some way to make atonement for what he failed to do previously. He failed to make proactive atonement. And so that's why I think that when some of the scholars take it as an either or, it's not about the tax, it's actually about the counting, because it's not trusting God's promises. I think that overlooks David's own words here, that he wants to pay the full cost so as to avert the plague. So I think that does link it back with the Exodus 30 tax. And we can basically close it out here with Lightheart. He says, chapter 21 ends with an odd note about the tabernacle of Moses, still pitched at Gibeon. David did not seek God there because he was terrified by the sword of the angel of Yahweh. The Mosaic tabernacle has become an Eden, guarded by a cherub with a flaming sword. David's sin has blocked that old path to Yahweh, but that does not leave David exiled from Yahweh's presence. The Mosaic Eden is closed, but David has purchased a place of sacrifice, and Yahweh has received it. David's sin results in a crucial turning point in the history of Israel's worship. Han makes that same point. There is no going back to paradise, but the offering on Moriah promises a new paradise to come. And Merrill makes the same note. He says why he reacted as he did is not explained. Perhaps he saw himself as an exile from Eden and, like Adam and Eve, could no longer go there because the garden was protected by cherubim with swords of fire. And even though we're done, let me go ahead and throw in the monkey wrench. That Selman notes here in page 195. He said, it is clear in 2 Samuel 24:1 that God incited David because he was angry with him. He says him, but the passage actually reads Israel. It's actually Israel that's under judgment. So he's using David to punish Israel, essentially. But he says This is not to be understood fatalistically. However, since according to 1 Samuel 26:19, any harmful effects of such incitement could be annulled by a positive human response. Ironically, in that context, David himself advises Saul to repent if he thought that God had incited him. On the same analogy, the census is to be understood as God's judgment on Israel, but the full effects could be avoided if David would only acknowledge the error of his ways. And I just throw that in there because that is a question that comes up, especially because it does kind of feel a lot like the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, Nebuchadnezzar, things like that. I'm not a Calvinist. I don't see the need for God to decree the actions of the people. I feel like he can know whether they will act in whatever ways. So in this particular instance, I think God knew that David would take the census, and he could then use that as a means of punishment, even if he doesn't decree that David does in fact take the census. But that is chapter 21, and that is me condensing as much as I can. It's a very in-depth chapter. Again, I'll try to post all the notes, especially like even the ones I didn't use, on Facebook or something. So I'll post a link. And next up, chapter 22, and then we're going to get into the preliminaries of the temple building pretty soon. So we'll see you then.